and Jason and I, we both do not like this phrase, but it does have a meaning, which is high value secondary claims. Now, the reason why we don't like it is because that implies that you forget about everything else, right? A 10% for tinnitus, a 0% for hypertension are really big, what I call gold mine claims. And although they have low ratings, don't let the high value secondary claim or high value claims dissuade you from submitting everything. But there are absolutely high value secondary claims, and there's actually 5 of them. And to be honest with you, it's the last 2 have 2 each. So whatever that math is mathing, right? So the very first topic we're going to cover is mental health secondary to chronic pain. Hands down, definitely the most high value secondary claim out there. We know mental health is rated, largely at 30, 50, 70%. Those are going to be the most common ratings. Another high value claim is sleep apnea secondary to mental health. And so now you can have chronic pain, have mental health on top of that, and then have sleep apnea on top of that mental health if you want to go that route. Another one is migraine secondary to, and there's really big 3 correlating conditions here, which is 1's mental health, 2 is tinnitus, and 3 are cervical conditions. So all of those, or one of those, can lead to your connection to migraines. And then the last 2 that have 2 each are going to be your nerve damage claims, right? So neck pain, cervical conditions causing nerve damage in your arms, and then your lower spine causing nerve damage in your legs. And those are going to be the high value claims. And then we're also going to talk about the easiest, or what I call automatic secondaries, because it's secondaries based off medication, right? Urinary frequency to hypertension is a huge one that everyone forgets. And then the most common claim, which is also an SMCK, is erectile dysfunction or female sexual arousal disorder for the female side of the house, secondary to mental health medication. Now, that was also a lot. And so, Jason, what I want to break down, and I want to pull this back up, because when you talk about Nexus letters, right, which sometimes I am a fan of Nexus letters in the appeal process specifically. There are some times when I recommend Nexus letters on initial claims. And when you talk about these high value secondary claims, that's whenever my mind goes, a Nexus letter might be needed. And you're looking at less than $800 for these. You're not going to find that value anywhere. So if you're thinking about it, now's the time. But the reason why this is important is because let's talk about mental health secondary to chronic pain. You can't x-ray mental health, right? It's just based on your medical evidence, what you're reporting, and obviously the severity of that condition. So when I say chronic pain, what I mean is anything that hurts that's musculoskeletal, right? So let's say you have a 40% IVDS back rating. Let's say you have, 2 knees at 30%. And so now your back and both of your knee conditions, that's going to cause chronic pain. And so now your son wants to go play baseball, or your baby wants to be picked up and fed, or whatever that looks like. You can't do that because you're in chronic pain, right? And that relationship, and that's just one example, that's going to drive into mental health. And that's where you're really going to find these huge secondary claims. And real quick, I'm going to kick it over back to you, Jason, just to speak about mental health. But mental health secondary to chronic pain has tons of evidence. Tons of evidence. It's not like tinnitus, where you see evidence where tinnitus causes issues, and then you see evidence where tinnitus is a symptom of an issue, and those are conflicting, right? And we'll talk about that later on. When it comes to mental health secondary to chronic pain, there is hardcore evidence, tons of it, where chronic pain will lead to depression, right? Will lead to anxiety, all these other conditions that veterans can be rated for. So, Jason, that was a lot on chronic pain. I'm going to push it back over to you and just speak about mental health and really that high value claim, because I think mental health is number one by far.
Right. Yeah. And it's funny that you're using mental health as the secondary, right? So yes, a lot of conditions suck. Those conditions create a drain on you mentally, and then you develop whatever it is, right? Depression, maybe that's followed up by some anxiety, and you have just a general adjustment disorder at that point. And yes, Clay, you're right. 30% If 30-50% on these types of things is fairly common. I would say that is probably the sweet spot as far as ratings that I see on the majority would be 30s, 50s in those kind of as a secondary aspect. Now, let's look at it from another way. I know what we're talking about a lot here is secondaries. And because, obviously we got this deal on for the Nexus letter, if you need to tie that together, which is great. Don't leave out the fact that there's also primary conditions, and those primary conditions also can be in some cases diagnosed, and you can get that Nexus letter and the DBQ all from this medical group, right? This is why we talk about them, because they are for veterans, helping veterans get over the hump with the VA. Now, let's talk about this, Clay. Look, PTSD and mental health conditions in general are a primary service-connected condition, one of the most common currently over the past 20 years or whatever, right, with the whole group. What kind of secondary conditions are we looking at from that, right? So mental health secondary conditions. Now, I just pulled up a few things here because I'm not as good. My brain doesn't work as good as Clay's being able to just rattle things off. So post-traumatic stress disorder can cause other health problems called secondary conditions, right? Some common secondary conditions include sleep apnea, migraines. It says headaches that can cause, obviously, they're bad migraines. GERD, never knew actually, but I guess it makes sense. Hypertension and erectile dysfunction. It also goes on here, Clay, to say other secondary conditions to PTSD include more mental health, right? Depression, anxiety, asthma, coronary artery disease, chronic fatigue syndrome, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, diabetes, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome, and tinnitus. I had no clue. Now, look, I'm not a medical person. I don't know if it's like it's that much or if it's this much. That's a conversation that you need to have with your medical provider and tie that line between the two if applicable. And if that line is drawn, service-connected mental health, secondary condition of XYZ, I mean, it could be a dramatic upward swing in ratings, Clay. So tell me a little bit about your thoughts on what I just said.
Yeah, no. So food for thought. I'm going to explain something. I just want everyone to know I'm not a medical doctor by any stretch of the means of what that means. Okay. But I've been in the hospital a lot, way too much than I want to. And so I've just listening to rounds every single morning, every single evening. I've gathered a ton. And I'm so glad you brought up PTSD and the gut. So like GERD, IBS, other gut conditions, super closely associated. And you also brought up, Jason, that you need to speak to your healthcare provider to kind of figure that out. And here's what that's going to look like, right? Let's say, you have something going on in your life, you have PTSD, you have reoccurring thoughts, nightmares, whatever that thing is for you, it's causing you to have PTSD, anxiety, which is putting stress on your body. So even when you sleep, you're not really resting because your insides are just tensed up all the time, right? And that stress on the body, what that could cause, could is the key word there, is stress on your gut, right? So someone who is anxious all the time is probably going to develop hypertension, right? High blood pressure. They're probably going to develop some neurological conditions down to the gut. So your brain's talking to your gut's talking to your brain because of the stress that's due on your body. That's where PTSD comes from. And so speaking with your healthcare provider, what your healthcare provider is probably going to do is look at other causes, right? Because they also have to rule out that part. I think that part gets left out every single time. We'll say GERD secondary to PTSD or IBS secondary to PTSD, which is totally possible if all the other causes, all the other, if these have been exhausted, right? And so what's your diet like? What other conditions do you have? Do you have you been scraped? Has your esophagus been scraped? Like, what is the cause of this? And if all those are kind of checked off and say, oh, not that, not that, not that, not that, man, this stress on your body, again, it's not something we can x-ray, right? This stress on your body. Now we have some serious medical evidence, some heavy correlating factors that can actually connect GERD or IBS secondary to PTSD. You can
Right.
get hypertension secondary, migraine secondary,
Yeah.
all of these things come into play.
Yeah.
But there's one key factor, and I don't want anyone to miss it. It's speaking to your healthcare team. Jason
Yep.
and I can't do it for you just because I explained it that way. If that is you or you fall in something like that, you can't do it for yourself. You need to have a doctor say, hey, that's what it is, right?
Yep.
That's what a diagnosis is. A diagnosis has a cause. Those are my
Yep.
thoughts. Now, I have
Yeah.
tons of other thoughts, Jason.
I love it. And